Tournament hall was already shaking with noise before the first serious match even began. Hundreds of spectators had packed into the wooden arena, filling every seat and crowding the walls. White karate uniforms covered the room like waves, broken only by a few dark uniforms worn by senior instructors. The smell of sweat, polished wood, and old training mats hung in the air. Everywhere, people were talking. They were talking about Chuck Norris. They were talking about the tournament. And they were talking about one strange rumor that had spread through the building that morning. Bruce Lee was there. Not on the stage, not scheduled to compete, not even announced as a special guest. He was simply sitting in the front row, quietly, watching. Bruce had arrived almost unnoticed. He wore simple clothes, nothing that suggested he wanted attention. He sat with his arms relaxed, his eyes moving from one fighter to another. Most people in the hall didn't realize who he was at first, but then one person noticed him, then another. Within minutes, whispers began spreading through the crowd. "Is that Bruce Lee? No way. Look at the front row. That's him." The whispers grew louder. But Bruce didn't react. He wasn't interested in being recognized. He was interested in watching, because Bruce had always believed that a person's true character appeared when the pressure became real. And that day, there was one fighter he couldn't stop watching. A young, exceptionally powerful man stood near the edge of the tournament floor. Blonde hair, broad shoulders, a physique that immediately attracted attention. His name was Dolph Lundgren. At that time, he was still young, hungry, and determined to prove himself. He wasn't there simply to participate. He wanted people to remember him. He wanted to show everyone that he belonged among the strongest. And more importantly, he wanted to prove that his physical strength could carry him against anyone, even legends. Dolph watched Chuck Norris from across the floor. Chuck stood calmly with his arms folded. He had already earned the respect of almost everyone in the room. His movements were controlled. His expression was calm. He didn't need to announce his ability. Everyone already knew. Dolph didn't like that. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was because Chuck seemed so comfortable. Maybe it was because people naturally gathered around him. Or maybe it was because Dolph had spent years trying to become someone people would respect, while Chuck seemed to receive respect without asking for it. Bruce noticed the way Dolph was staring. His eyes narrowed slightly. He leaned back in his chair. Something about the young fighter bothered him. Not his strength, his attitude. There was something unsettled behind those eyes, something impatient, something desperate. Then the tournament continued. Match after match, fighter after fighter stepped onto the mat. The crowd cheered. Instructors shouted instructions. Feet slapped against the wooden floor. Occasionally, the hall erupted when someone landed a perfectly timed technique. But Bruce remained focused on one thing: Dolph. The young fighter finally entered the competition area. The crowd became louder. He was powerful, fast, and aggressive. His first opponent barely had time to react. Dolph moved forward with frightening speed. One strike, a second, a powerful takedown. The match was over. The crowd applauded. Dolph stood in the center of the mat, breathing heavily. He looked around. He wanted approval. He wanted admiration. And for a moment, he got it. But then his eyes found Bruce Lee. Bruce wasn't clapping. He wasn't smiling. He was simply watching. Dolph's expression changed. For the first time that day, someone had defeated him without touching him. Bruce had made him feel uncertain. Dolph walked away. but he kept looking back. Bruce noticed. He said nothing. Several more matches passed. Eventually, the tournament reached one of its most anticipated moments. Chuck Norris stepped onto the mat. The crowd erupted. Chuck acknowledged the audience with a small nod. Then he faced his opponent. The atmosphere changed immediately. There was something different about watching Chuck fight. He didn't waste movement. He didn't try to intimidate anyone. He simply waited. His opponent attacked. Chuck moved. A step, a turn, a block, a counter. Everything happened so quickly that some spectators didn't even understand what they had seen. The match ended. The crowd exploded with applause. Chuck walked away calmly. Dolph watched from the side. His jaw tightened. He had just watched a man win without appearing angry, without appearing nervous, without trying to prove anything. And somehow, that made Dolph even more frustrated. He walked toward Chuck. Several people noticed. The noise in the room began to fade. Chuck looked at him. "Something wrong?" he asked. Dolph smiled. "I just wanted to know if you're always this calm." Chuck shrugged. "Usually." Dolph laughed. "Must be nice." Chuck didn't answer. That silence irritated Dolph more than an insult would have. He stepped closer. "You know," Dolph said, "sometimes people get too comfortable because everyone tells them they're great." Chuck looked directly into his eyes. "And sometimes people get angry because nobody tells them what they want to hear." A few people in the crowd reacted. Dolph's smile disappeared. For several seconds, neither man moved. And then, from the front row, Bruce Lee quietly stood up. The entire room seemed to notice. Bruce didn't walk toward them. He simply stood there, watching. Dolph looked at him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything became silent. Bruce's expression was calm, almost impossibly calm. Dolph finally broke the silence. "You have something to say?" Bruce shook his head. "No." "Then why are you standing?" "Because I want to see what happens next." The crowd became restless. Chuck glanced toward Bruce. There was a faint smile on his face. He understood exactly what Bruce was doing. Bruce wasn't choosing a side. He was observing. He wanted to know whether Dolph could control himself. And that was about to become very important, because Dolph stepped forward. "Maybe we should find out who the strongest man in this room really is." Chuck answered quietly. "This isn't the place." Dolph laughed. "That's what I thought." Chuck's expression changed. Not anger, disappointment. "You're confusing control with weakness." Those words hit Dolph harder than any punch. His shoulders tightened. His fists closed. He moved suddenly. Chuck reacted immediately. The two men collided. The crowd screamed. For a second, it looked like an ordinary exchange. But then Dolph grabbed Chuck aggressively around the upper body. Chuck tried to create distance. Dolph refused to let him go. People began shouting, "Stop! Break it up! Back away!" Bruce's eyes narrowed. He had seen enough. He knew exactly what was happening. This was no longer competition. This was ego. And ego was dangerous. Dolph suddenly pulled Chuck backward. Chuck struggled to regain his balance. The audience gasped. Bruce took one step forward, then another. The entire front row seemed to freeze. And then Dolph struck. The sound of the impact echoed through the hall. Chuck staggered. The crowd went silent. No cheering, no shouting, nothing. Just silence. Bruce stopped walking. His eyes remained fixed on Dolph. Dolph stood there, breathing heavily. For a moment, he looked victorious. Then he looked at Bruce, and the expression on Bruce's face changed everything. Bruce wasn't angry. He wasn't frightened. He wasn't impressed. He looked disappointed. Deeply disappointed. Dolph suddenly realized that the strongest person in the room wasn't watching his muscles. Bruce was watching his mind. And Bruce had just seen something Dolph didn't want anyone to see. Fear. A question for everyone watching. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you had been sitting in that front row when Dolph attacked Chuck, what would you have done? Would you have stepped in immediately? Or would you have waited to see what Bruce Lee would do? Write, "Step in" or "Wait" in the comments. And tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, Canada, the UK, India, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, or somewhere else? If you're enjoying this story, hit the like button, subscribe, and stay with us. Because Bruce Lee had finally stood up, and everyone in that hall was about to discover why Bruce Lee didn't need to throw the first punch to control a room. Bruce walked slowly toward the mat. Every step seemed louder than the last. Dolph watched him approach. The crowd separated automatically. Nobody told them to move. They simply did. Bruce stopped several feet away. He looked at Chuck first. "Are you all right?" Chuck nodded. "I'm fine." Then Bruce turned toward Dolph. Dolph tried to maintain his confidence. "What?" Bruce didn't answer immediately. He studied him, from head to toe, not like a fighter examining an opponent, like a teacher examining a student who had just made a terrible mistake. Finally, Bruce spoke. "You're strong." Dolph's expression softened slightly. "Thank you." Bruce continued. "But you're not in control." The room became completely silent. Dolph frowned. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Bruce shook his head. "No, you know exactly what you want to do." That distinction cut deeper than Dolph expected. Bruce stepped closer. "You wanted everyone in this room to fear you." Dolph said nothing. "You wanted Chuck to recognize your strength." Still nothing. "And now you want me to fight you." Dolph's eyes narrowed. Bruce continued, "Because if I fight you, you don't have to think about what happened." Dolph stared at him. Bruce's voice remained quiet. "You can blame the fight. You can blame Chuck. You can blame me. But you won't have to blame yourself." Those words struck the young fighter harder than anything that had happened on the mat. Dolph looked away. For the first time that afternoon, he didn't know what to say. Chuck slowly approached. He placed a hand on Dolph's shoulder. Dolph flinched. Chuck said quietly, "You're better than this." Dolph looked at him. "Then why doesn't it feel like it?" Chuck didn't answer. Bruce did. "Because you're trying to prove your worth to people who never asked you to prove it." Dolph's eyes became glassy. Nobody in the crowd expected that. They had expected another fight, another display of strength. Instead, they were watching something much more uncomfortable. A man being forced to confront himself. Bruce turned toward the crowd. "Martial arts isn't about showing people how dangerous you are." He looked back at Dolph. "It is about becoming the kind of person who doesn't need to." No one spoke. The tournament officials stood frozen. The spectators didn't know whether to applaud. Chuck didn't move. Dolph lowered his fists, slowly. Then he took a deep breath. For several seconds he stood there. Finally he looked at Bruce. "If I hit you," Dolph said quietly, "would you hit me back?" Bruce smiled. That depends. On what? On whether you're trying to hurt me, Bruce paused, or trying to learn. Dolph stared at him, and somewhere in that enormous hall, a single spectator began clapping. Then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted. Not because someone had won, not because someone had been defeated, but because everyone had just witnessed something much rarer. A fighter had finally chosen control over anger. Bruce returned to his seat. Chuck walked away, and Dolph remained standing on the mat, staring at his own hands. He had entered the tournament wanting everyone to remember how powerful he was. Instead, he was going to leave remembering something much more important. The most dangerous moment of a fight wasn't always the moment someone attacked. Sometimes, it was the moment you realized you were fighting yourself. And Bruce Lee had been sitting in the front row the entire time, waiting for that realization. But what nobody knew was that Bruce had one final lesson planned, and it would happen after the crowd had gone home. Because Dolph's real test had not even begun. The tournament hall slowly began to empty. The loud voices that had filled the building only minutes earlier were fading into distant echoes. Spectators gathered their coats. Fighters carried their bags toward the changing rooms. Instructors spoke quietly among themselves. But 3 men remained near the training floor: Chuck Norris, Dolph Lundgren, and Bruce Lee. Dolph stood alone near the center of the mat. His fists were no longer clenched. His shoulders had dropped. The anger that had filled his face earlier had disappeared, replaced by something much more difficult to hide: confusion. Bruce approached him slowly. "You still want to fight?" Bruce asked. Dolph looked up. "I don't know." "That is the first honest answer you've given today." Dolph looked away. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Dolph said something Bruce hadn't expected. "I've spent years trying to become strong." Bruce nodded. "I can see that. But I don't know when strong became the only thing I cared about." Bruce looked at him carefully. "That happens easily." "How?" "When people praise your strength, you start believing strength is all you have." Dolph swallowed. Bruce walked toward the center of the empty mat. "Come here." Dolph followed. Bruce stood several feet away from him. "No audience now," Bruce said. "No cameras. No tournament. No reputation." He paused. "Just you." Dolph nodded. Bruce raised one hand. "Attack me." Dolph hesitated. "What?" "You heard me. You want me to attack you?" Bruce nodded. Dolph slowly raised his fists. He moved forward. A fast punch. Bruce shifted his head slightly. The punch missed. Dolph followed with another. Bruce moved again. No dramatic counterattack, no flashy strike, just movement. Dolph attacked again. Bruce stepped away, again and again. After several attempts, Dolph stopped. He was breathing heavily. Bruce wasn't. Dolph looked frustrated. "Why aren't you fighting me?" Bruce smiled. "I am." Dolph frowned. "No, you're avoiding me." Bruce shook his head. "I'm making you fight the wrong opponent." Dolph stared at him. Bruce pointed toward the floor. "Your body is attacking me." He tapped Dolph lightly on the chest. "But your mind is attacking itself." Dolph became silent. Bruce suddenly moved. He stepped forward so quickly that Dolph barely saw him. Bruce touched Dolph's shoulder, then his wrist, then his chest. 3 movements. No force, no injury. But Dolph was suddenly off balance. He stumbled backward. Bruce caught him before he fell. Dolph looked stunned. "You didn't even hit me." Bruce smiled. "Exactly." Dolph looked at the floor. Bruce continued, "Anyone can learn how to hit." He paused. "Very few learn when not to." Dolph breathed slowly. The lesson continued. For the next hour, Bruce didn't teach Dolph how to punch harder. He taught him how to stop. Stop before anger. Stop before pride. Stop before fear. Every time Dolph rushed forward, Bruce made him reset. Every time Dolph tried to overpower him, Bruce redirected him. Every time Dolph became frustrated, Bruce stopped the exercise. Again, Dolph attacked. Again, he tried again. Again, another attempt. Finally, Dolph dropped his hands. "I don't understand." Bruce smiled. "Good." Dolph looked at him. "Good?" "Yes." Bruce walked toward him. "When you think you understand everything, you stop learning." Dolph sat down on the edge of the mat. He was exhausted. Not physically, mentally. Bruce sat beside him. After a long silence, Dolph finally spoke. "When I was younger, I thought if I became strong enough, nobody could ever make me feel small again." Bruce didn't interrupt. Dolph continued. "So every time someone challenged me, I felt like I had to prove something." Bruce nodded. "That is why you attacked Chuck." Dolph lowered his head. "Yes." Chuck, who had been standing near the doorway, finally walked over. Dolph looked embarrassed. "I owe you an apology." Chuck nodded. "You do?" Dolph expected anger. Instead, Chuck extended his hand. Dolph looked at it for a moment before taking it. The handshake was brief, but something changed. The tension disappeared. Bruce watched quietly. Then he said, "That's the first victory you've had today." Dolph looked at him. "I lost the fight." Bruce smiled. "You lost your temper." Dolph thought about it. Then he smiled too. "And that's a victory?" "For the first time," Bruce said, "yes." Another question for everyone watching. Let me ask you something. If you were in Dolph's position, would you rather have Bruce Lee teach you how to hit harder or teach you how to control yourself under pressure? Comment "hit harder" or "control." And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far this story has traveled. If you're enjoying this dramatized Bruce Lee story, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and stay until the end. Because what happened next completely changed the way Dolph looked at Bruce Lee. The next morning, the tournament hall was almost empty. Only a few instructors remained. The mats had been cleaned. The chairs had been stacked against the walls. The banners were beginning to come down. Dolph arrived early. He expected Bruce to already be there. He wasn't. Dolph waited. 10 minutes. 20. Then he heard footsteps. Bruce entered through the side door carrying nothing except a small training bag. He looked at Dolph. "You came early." "I couldn't sleep." Bruce smiled. "Why?" "Because I kept thinking about what you said." Bruce placed his bag on the floor. "And?" Dolph took a deep breath. "I think I finally understand." Bruce raised an eyebrow. "Tell me." Dolph looked around the empty hall. "Yesterday, I thought the strongest person was the person nobody could defeat." Bruce said nothing. "Now I think it's the person who doesn't need to defeat anyone." Bruce smiled. Better, Dolph laughed. But not completely right? Not completely. Dolph shook his head. You really don't make anything easy. Bruce laughed softly. Easy answers create weak minds. They began training again. This time, Bruce changed the exercise. He asked Dolph to stand completely still. Dolph looked confused. What am I supposed to do? Nothing. For how long? Until you stop wanting to do something. Dolph smiled. You're serious? Very. Dolph stood still. 10 seconds. 20. 30. His body began shifting. Bruce immediately noticed. Stop. Dolph froze. You moved. I barely moved. Barely is still moved. Dolph sighed. Again. They repeated the exercise. Eventually, Dolph began to understand. The hardest thing wasn't movement. It was patience. The ability to wait. The ability to observe. The ability to let another person reveal their intention before reacting. Bruce wasn't teaching Dolph a particular martial arts technique. He was teaching him a way of thinking. Then suddenly, Bruce attacked. A lightning-fast movement. Dolph reacted. He blocked. Bruce stopped. Dolph smiled. I got it. Bruce shook his head. No. Dolph frowned. You blocked it. You reacted. Isn't that the point? No. Bruce stepped back. The point is to see it before it happens. Dolph stared at him. Bruce continued. When you react, you're already late. Those words stayed with Dolph. Later that afternoon, Chuck returned. He watched Bruce and Dolph training from the doorway. After several minutes, Chuck approached. You've been working hard. Dolph nodded. I have. Chuck looked at Bruce. What are you teaching him? Bruce smiled. I'm trying to teach him something he can't learn from a trophy. Chuck laughed. Dolph looked between them. What's that? Bruce answered. Humility. Dolph groaned. That's going to take longer than one morning. Bruce laughed. Chuck laughed, too. For the first time since the tournament began, Dolph laughed with them. The young fighter who had entered the hall desperate to prove himself was slowly disappearing. Something else was taking his place. Something calmer. Something stronger. But there was still one final test. Bruce knew it. Chuck knew it. And Dolph was about to discover it. That evening, a small group of senior fighters returned to the hall. They had heard what happened the previous day. Some believed Dolph had been humiliated. Others believed Bruce had somehow intimidated him. One fighter challenged Dolph. Let's see if you've really changed. Dolph looked at Bruce. Bruce didn't answer. He simply nodded toward the mat. Go. Dolph stepped forward. The fighter attacked immediately. Dolph blocked. The crowd watched. Another attack. Dolph moved. Another. He waited. Then he countered. The exchange lasted only seconds. Dolph had the opportunity to finish the fight. Everyone saw it. But he stopped. The other fighter looked confused. Why did you stop? Dolph lowered his hands. Because I already won. The fighter laughed. You haven't beaten me. Dolph smiled. I don't need to. Bruce watched from the edge of the mat. A tiny smile appeared on his face. Chuck noticed. He walked over. Looks like your lesson worked. Bruce shook his head. No. Chuck raised an eyebrow. Bruce looked toward Dolph. He learned it himself. And that was the moment Bruce knew the young fighter had finally understood. Strength wasn't the ability to destroy someone. Strength was having the ability to destroy them and choosing not to. But there was one question still hanging in the air. Why had Bruce cared so much about Dolph? Why had he intervened? Why had he spent an entire day teaching a young fighter who wasn't even his student? The answer would come that night, and it would reveal something about Bruce Lee that almost nobody in the room knew, because years earlier, Bruce himself had made a mistake very similar to Dolph's, a mistake that had nearly cost him everything, and Bruce had recognized his younger self in Dolph. That was why he had stood up from the front row. That was why he had refused to fight, and that was why he had decided to teach. But the story wasn't over, not even close, because the next challenge wouldn't come from Dolph, it wouldn't come from Chuck, and it wouldn't even come from another fighter. It would come from someone who had been watching Bruce Lee from the shadows since the tournament began. Someone who believed Bruce had humiliated Dolph, someone who believed Bruce had no right to interfere, and someone who was now preparing to challenge Bruce himself. The following morning, a folded note would be waiting on Bruce's training bag. There would be only 6 words written on it. "You should have stayed in your seat." Bruce would read it once. Then he would smile, because he already knew exactly who had written it. And for the first time since arriving at the tournament, Bruce Lee knew he might actually have to fight. The next morning, Bruce Lee arrived at the tournament hall before anyone else. The building was almost empty. Sunlight entered through the high windows, falling across the polished wooden floor. The banners from the previous day's tournament still hung above the training area. Bruce placed his small training bag beside the mat. Then he noticed something. A folded piece of paper was lying on top of it. He picked it up. There were only 6 words written across the page. "You should have stayed in your seat." Bruce read the sentence once, then he smiled. He didn't look frightened. He didn't even look surprised. Instead, he folded the note and placed it back inside his bag. A few minutes later, Chuck Norris entered the hall. He immediately noticed Bruce's expression. "What happened?" Bruce handed him the note. Chuck read it. His face became serious. "You know who wrote this?" Bruce nodded. "Yes." "Who?" Bruce looked toward the empty entrance. "Someone who wasn't watching the tournament." Chuck frowned. "What does that mean?" Bruce answered quietly. "They were watching me." Before Chuck could respond, footsteps echoed through the hallway. A man entered. He was older than Dolph, heavily built, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent years fighting. He stopped several feet away. His eyes were fixed on Bruce. "You embarrassed him yesterday." Bruce remained calm. "I didn't embarrass anyone." "You made him look weak." Bruce shook his head. "He made himself look weak when he lost control." The man's jaw tightened. "You think you're better than everyone here?" Bruce smiled. "No." "Then prove it." Chuck stepped forward. "There's no reason for this." The man ignored him. His eyes remained on Bruce. "Everyone thinks Bruce Lee is untouchable." Bruce finally stood. "I'm not untouchable." The man smiled. "Good." Bruce stepped onto the mat. The hall suddenly felt smaller. There were no hundreds of spectators now, no cheering, no tournament announcer. Only Bruce Lee and the man standing opposite him. The man attacked first. A powerful punch came toward Bruce's face. Bruce moved just enough. The punch missed. Another followed. Bruce blocked. Another. He stepped aside. The attacker became frustrated. He increased his speed. Bruce continued moving, never wasting energy, never striking back. Finally, the man shouted, "Fight me!" Bruce looked directly into his eyes. "I am fighting you." "No, you're running." Bruce shook his head. "You're fighting my body." He paused. "I'm fighting your anger." The man froze. Bruce moved forward. One quick step. He touched the man's shoulder. The man lost his balance. Before he could recover, Bruce had already moved behind him. No punch, no kick, no dramatic attack, just control. The man dropped to one knee. The hall became silent. Bruce offered him a hand. The man stared at it, then slowly accepted. Bruce pulled him back to his feet. "You wanted to know whether I'm better than you." Bruce looked at him. "That's the wrong question." The man said nothing. Bruce continued, "The better question is whether you are better than the person you were yesterday." Those words broke something inside the man. His anger disappeared. He looked down. "I thought strength meant never backing down." Bruce smiled. "Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the first one willing to walk away." The man nodded. Then he turned toward the exit. Before leaving, he stopped. "Bruce?" Bruce looked at him. "Why did you help Dolph?" Bruce was silent for several seconds. Then he answered, "Because I saw myself in him." Chuck looked at Bruce. Bruce continued, "When I was younger, I also believed I had to prove that I was strong." He looked at his hands. "I eventually learned that the hardest opponent isn't standing across from you." He looked up. "It's the person inside you." The man slowly left. Chuck waited until the door closed. "You really saw yourself in Dolph?" Bruce nodded. "More than he knows." One more question for everyone watching. If you were standing in that empty hall, watching Bruce Lee defeat a much stronger opponent without throwing a single damaging punch, what would you have thought? Was Bruce's greatest weapon his speed, his skill, or his mind? Comment. Speed, skill, or mind below. And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. If you're enjoying the story, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us. Because Bruce thought the danger was over. He was wrong. That evening, Dolph returned to the hall. He found Bruce sitting alone near the front row. Dolph approached slowly. "I heard what happened." Bruce looked up. "And?" Dolph smiled. "I think I'm starting to understand why you sat here yesterday." Bruce raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Dolph looked toward the empty mat. "You weren't watching the fights." He paused. "You were watching the people." Bruce smiled. "Now you're learning." Dolph nodded. Then he asked the question that Bruce had been expecting. "Do you think I'll ever become as good as you?" Bruce laughed softly. "Don't try to become me." Dolph looked confused. "Then who should I become?" Bruce stood. "Become someone you don't need to be ashamed of when the room is empty." Dolph remained silent. Bruce walked toward the exit. Before leaving, he turned around. "One more thing." "What?" "Tomorrow, I want you to fight again." Dolph smiled. "Who?" Bruce looked toward the tournament floor. "Yourself." Then Bruce walked away. Dolph stood alone in the empty hall, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of losing a fight. He was afraid of becoming the person he had once been, and that fear might be exactly what finally made him strong. The next morning, the tournament hall was quiet. Dolph stood alone on the mat, waiting for Bruce. A few minutes later, Bruce entered. He looked at Dolph and smiled. "Ready?" Dolph nodded. "For what?" Bruce pointed toward the mirror on the wall. "For the hardest fight." Dolph looked at his reflection. For the first time, he understood what Bruce had meant. He didn't need to defeat another fighter. He needed to defeat the anger, pride, and fear that had controlled him for so long. Bruce walked toward the exit. Dolph called after him, "Bruce!" Bruce stopped. "Thank you." Bruce turned and smiled. "Don't thank me. Prove it by the way you live." Dolph nodded. He stood alone in the empty hall, staring at his reflection. Yesterday, he had wanted everyone to fear his strength. Now, he finally understood what strength really meant. Not being the strongest person in the room, not winning every fight, not making others afraid. True strength was having the power to hurt someone, and choosing not to. Bruce Lee had never needed to throw the hardest punch that day. He had done something far more difficult. He had changed the direction of a man's life. And as Bruce disappeared through the doorway, Dolph finally understood the lesson he would remember forever. The greatest fight is not against the person standing in front of you. It is against the person you become when anger takes control. The hall became silent again. But this time, Dolph wasn't afraid of the silence. He was finally at peace with it.